Hello everybody, this is Fernando for the latest aliens and UFOs video. Alright, let's go ahead and let's start with chapter 4 of the book UFO Sightings by Alan Baker. This one having to do with now close encounters of the fourth kind. This is the scary stuff. This is the one involving actual abductions. As the book describes it, it's human beings are taken from their normal surroundings against their will and are forced to interact in various ways with non-human entities. So definitely some creepy stuff when it comes to this type of close encounter. You've heard those stories, you've seen some of those movies too, and now there's going to be several examples posted here from that chapter. I probably talked about a few of them already on my playlist. Some of them might be new to me, so there'll be good stuff to be able to feature on my channel later on. But without further ado, let's go ahead and let's do part 1 of chapter 4. Once again, talking about close encounters of the fourth kind. So here's the first segment, which is called The Darkening Skies. The case of Barney and Betty Hill has been included in virtually every book dealing with alleged alien encounters, beginning with John G. Fuller's excellent investigation, The Interrupted Journey, first published in 1966. Such is its importance, however, that it must be included here, not least because it is the first comprehensively examined example of a close encounter of the fourth kind, i.e. abduction by non-human beings. Prior to the Hills' experience in 1961, the only communication that had taken place between human beings and UFO pilots had been those reported by the contactees, who claimed to have been visited by beautiful and benign space brothers who had come from various planets within our own solar system with a message of peace and universal love. The Hill case was to sound the death knell for such platitudes, serving as a prototype for subsequent encounters with the ruthless and almost militaristic Greys. In fact, as we shall see, the appearance of the aliens themselves seems to correspond to an intermediate stage between the entirely human-looking space brothers and the insectoid creatures that are so frequently reported today. The Hills met their appointment with destiny on the night of September 19th to the 20th, 1961, as they were driving back from a holiday in Canada to their home in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. They expected to be home between 2:30 and 3 o'clock a.m. When they were just south of Lancaster, Betty Hill noticed a bright star, which seemed to be following the car. Betty looked at it through a pair of binoculars and saw what seemed to be a row of windows. Barney Hill assured his wife that the star was merely a plane. Nevertheless, he stopped the car, took the binoculars, and walked a little way into an adjacent field to see for himself. He saw a group of strange men at the windows of the craft staring back at him. Moments later, he was running back to the car, screaming hysterically that they were about to be captured. As they drove away, the couple heard a strange beeping sound and became intolerably drowsy. Moments later, they heard another similar sound, and Betty turned to her husband, saying, "Now do you believe in flying saucers?" "Don't be ridiculous, of course not," Barney replied. They continued on their journey home without further incident, arriving just after 5 a.m., about 2.5 hours later than they should have. As they got out of the car, they noticed some strange, shiny spots on the paintwork. When a compass was later held to them, at the suggestion of Betty's sister who had seen a UFO, the needle span wildly. This piece of physical evidence has never been satisfactorily explained. About a week later, Betty began to have disturbing dreams of being captured by strange creatures. She wrote to Major Donald E. Kehoe of NICAP, describing the UFO sighting. 2 months later, the Hills were visited by several NICAP members who went through the encounter with them in minute detail. According to Barney, they were mentally reconstructing the whole trip. One of them said, "What took you so long to get home?" They said, "You were this distance and it took you these hours. Where were you?" Well, when they said this, I thought I was really going to crack up. I became suddenly flabbergasted to think that I realized for the first time that the rate of speed I always travel, we should have arrived home at least 2 hours earlier than we did. Barney and Betty were referred to respected Boston psychiatrist and neurologist Dr. Benjamin Simon, who began a series of hypnotic regression sessions in an attempt to probe the missing hours. It had been their collective intention to explore any possible links between the Hills' apparent UFO experience and certain physical problems, such as stomach ulcers from which Barney suffered, in addition to psychological factors, including the couple's interracial marriage, their previous marriages, and their social and civil rights work. The Hills were hypnotized separately and were not allowed to hear the tape recorder results until Dr. Simon had completed the program. The tale that emerged was unlike anything previously reported and made headlines all over the world. According to their testimony, given under hypnosis, the Hills had been taken from their car by a group of bizarre humanoid creatures who guided them into a landed UFO and subjected them to the by now familiar medical examination. This included a pregnancy test on Betty by means of a long needle inserted into her abdomen. When the aliens had finished, Betty asked the one she called the leader where they came from. I said that I knew he wasn't from the Earth, and he asked if I knew anything about the universe, and I told him no. I knew practically nothing. And when he went across the room, there was an opening, and he pulled out a map. It was an oblong map, and there were all these dots on it. Some were little, just pinpoints, and other was big as a nickel. Those were curved lines going from one dot to another. And then there was one big circle, and it had a lot of lines coming out of it. A lot of the lines going to another circle, quite close, but not as big. And I asked him what they meant. And he said that the heavy lines were trade routes. The solid lines were places they went to occasionally. And he said the broken lines were expeditions. So I asked him where was his home port. And he said, "Where are you on the map?" I looked and I laughed and I said, "I don't know." So he said, "If you don't know where you are, then there isn't any point in my telling you where I am from." And he put the map back into the space in the wall. One of the most intriguing aspects of the case, and one of the most significant in terms of UFO history, involves the attempt made by school teacher and amateur astronomer Marjorie Fish to create a three-dimensional model of Betty's drawing of the star map. Fish created the model out of beads and string in 1968, trying to find the match between the map and the nearest stars to our solar system. The result was inspected by astronomer Terence Dickerson, who concluded that the star map was a view from several light years beyond the binary system Zeta Reticuli, looking back towards the sun and the star 82 Eridani. This seemed to offer astonishing confirmation of the presence of explorers from another star system, although skeptics argued quite rightly that there were so many stars out there that some sort of match was inevitable. And yet, largely thanks to the Fish interpretation, Zeta Reticuli has come to be regarded by many ufologists as the origin of at least one of the alien species currently visiting the Earth. The aliens themselves were facially not quite like humans. They were similar but eerily different. Their eyes were a little larger than ours, with a wider lateral field of vision, but with pupils and irises. Their nose were vestigial, little more than 2 holes, likewise with their ears. Strangely, Barney described the aliens' noses as above, while Betty described them as being very large, like Jimmy Durante's. Their heads, utterly devoid of hair, were only slightly larger than ours. In short, they were too strange to be taken for humans, yet not strange enough to be taken for greys, whose basic characteristics, large eyes, large cranium, no nose or ears, they shared. As far as Dr. Simon was concerned, the Hills' experience had been entirely subjective, in effect, a waking dream. While he accepted that they believed what they were relating, Simon noted several correlations between Betty's testimony and documented dream symbolism. For instance, Betty had asked the leader for some proof of their encounter, and he had complied by giving her a book containing strange symbols. However, this provoked an argument among the aliens. The leader told her he had to take the book off her because they could not leave behind such concrete evidence of their presence. This ties in most rather strikingly with a certain aspect of Betty's unhappy childhood. She had frequently sought escape from her depression in books, but her mother, an extremely stern character, had insisted on limiting her reading. There were also some illogicalities in the encounter. For instance, The aliens were fascinated by the notion of time as experienced by humans and asked Betty to define old age, lifespan, and the year. But when Betty and Barney were about to leave the craft, the leader asked them to wait a minute. Dr. Simon pointed out that contradictions of this kind are frequently found in dreams, which are the mind's way of grappling with conflicts, fears, desires, and other problems. There's no doubt that the Hills' interracial marriage was a potential source of great stress. Although they were happy together, their situation was extremely unusual in 1960s America. In addition, they both had previous marriages and were separated from the children of those marriages. Dr. Simon suggested that these stresses and conflicts may have resulted in Betty's nightmares, which she related to Barney. The perhaps genuine UFO sighting on their journey home from Canada might have been a catalyst for the abduction scenario, which was based on those stresses and conflicts and which was then relived by the couple during their hypnosis. Notwithstanding these speculations, the fact remains that the ultimate nature of the Hills' encounter is still open to debate. In view of the other close encounters with non-humans discussed in this book and elsewhere, it remains well within the bounds of possibility that Barney and Betty Hill experienced something genuinely anomalous. Next segment is called All in the Mind. At 9:15 p.m. on July 3rd, 1972, Maureen Putty, a 37-year-old housewife from Rye in Victoria, Australia, was returning home from a visit to her son who was in a hospital when she had the first of a series of apparent close encounters. Her experiences were to give rise to intense debate in the ufology community, not least because it became clear that only her consciousness was being abducted. On the first occasion, the road on which she was traveling suddenly became bathed in intense blue light, a frequently reported element in abductions. Mrs. Putty looked up to see a disc-shaped object which seemed to be generating a humming noise similar to that of an elevator. The object paced the car and its alarm driver for several miles before streaking away. 3 weeks later, on July 25th, Mrs. Putty was driving on the same road when the UFO returned, this time causing her car's engine to stall. As the vehicle gradually came to a halt, she heard a disembodied voice saying, "All your tests will be negative. Tell the media, do not panic. We mean no harm." Then the voice said, "You now have control," and the car's engine started. The UFO streaked away into the sky again. Mrs. Putty reported both of her sightings to the Royal Australian Air Force, who sent her forms to complete. She also contacted several television stations and was interviewed by one of them. In February the following year, 1973, Mrs. Putty felt an eerie presence in her home. Once again, she heard a strange, disembodied voice which said, "Go back to the same meeting place." Understandably unwilling to do so alone, she telephoned the Victorian UFO Research Society. Two members of WUFers, Judith McGee and Paul Norman, agreed to meet her at the location. One of the UFO entities arrived early, however, appearing in the front passenger seat beside her as she was on her way to the rendezvous. The entity had long blonde hair and was wearing a white ski-type suit. It vanished immediately, and Mrs. Putty continued without further incident. At the location of her earlier sightings, Mrs. Putty sat with the two WUFers investigators in her car and waited for the next development. It wasn't long in coming. Mrs. Putty became aware of the same entity standing outside the car. It beckoned to her, but she refused to leave the car. Neither of those two other investigators saw that man. It was at that point that the most unusual aspect of the case became apparent. Mrs. Putty suddenly fainted, and although she seemed to be unconscious, began to describe what she was experiencing. She claimed to be in a circular, windowless room. Rising from the floor was a mushroom-shaped object covered with hieroglyphics. The man was there with her and told her to describe what she was seeing. Since there was no apparent way of escaping, Mrs. Putty became very frightened and started to cry. She then returned to normal consciousness in the car with no memory of her experience. About a week later, Mrs. Putty was driving with her son sitting beside her in the front of the car. Without warning, that man appeared once again and on the bench seat between them. It was raining heavily and visibility was very bad, but while he was there, the weather improved dramatically. Mrs. Putty and her son were able to see for miles around. When the man disappeared a few moments later, the poor weather conditions resumed. As we shall see a little bit later, many researchers are content to consider the abduction phenomenon in purely concrete terms, with solid, fresh, and brewed aliens kidnapping people and conducting various unpleasant experiments on them. But the experiences of people like Maureen Putty would seem to indicate that this is not necessarily the case. Neither can many of these experiences be accounted for by any theories in mainstream psychology, although certain concepts such as lucid dreams, hypnagogic and hypnopompic imagery, and fantasy-prone personalities may cast some light on these distressing events. We shall examine these possible examinations in the final sections of this book. Next one is called the Pascagoula Fisherman. On October 11th, 1973, an abduction incident occurred that once again made headlines all over the world. Charlie Hickson, 45, and Calvin Parker, 18, of Pascagoula, Mississippi, had decided to go fishing in the Pascagoula River. Their experience was reported by the United Press International the following day. Two shipyard workers who claimed they were hauled aboard a UFO and examined by silver-skinned creatures with big eyes and pointed ears were checked today at a military hospital and found to be free of radiation. Jackson County Chief Deputy Barney Mathis said the men told him they were fishing from an old pier on the west bank of the Pascagoula River at about 7 p.m. Thursday when they noticed a strange craft about 2 miles away emitting a bluish haze. They said it moved closer and then appeared to hover about 3 or 4 feet above the water. Then 3 whatever they were came out, either floating or walking, and carried us into the ship. Officers quoted Hickson as saying, "They had big eyes. They kept us about 20 minutes, photographed us, and then took us back into the pier. The only sound they made was a buzzing, humming sound. They left in a flash." "These are reliable people," Sheriff Diamond said. "They had no reason to say this if it had not been true. I know something did happen to them." The sheriff said the spacecraft was described as fish-shaped, about 10 feet long, with an 8-foot-high ceiling. The occupants were said to have pale, silvery gray skin, no hair, long pointed ears and noses with an opening for a mouth, and then hands like crab claws. The sight of these creatures coming towards him had evidently been too much for the younger man Parker, who fainted and remained unconscious throughout the rest of the encounter. Hickson described being placed in a horizontal floating position and being scanned by an instrument resembling an enormous eye. Dr. J. Allen Hynek, who was no longer working for the U.S. Air Force, having established his own civilian research group, the Center for UFO Studies in Chicago, flew to Pascagoula to look into the case, along with investigative journalist Ralph Blum. According to Sheriff Diamond, whom they interviewed, the 2 men had requested a lie detector test to prove that they were telling the truth. And Calvin, he added, "I'm not easily convinced, but I heard that boy pray when he was alone and thought that nobody could hear. That was enough for me." The police had tried to trick the 2 men into revealing a hoax. On one occasion, they left them in a room with a hidden tape recorder, but Hickson and Parker maintained their story, even though they thought at least no one was listening. Parker said, "I passed out. I expect I never passed out in my whole life." Hickson said, "I've never seen nothing like that before in my life. You can't make people believe it." Parker said, "You see how that damn door come right up?" And Hickson said, "I don't know how it happened, son. I don't know." Parker said, "It just laid up, and just like those sons of bitches, just like they just come out." Hickson said, "I know, you can't believe it. You can't make people believe it." Hickson and Parker were subsequently hypnotized by UFO researcher James Harder, who concluded that they had indeed been abducted by extraterrestrial creatures. Hynek, ever cautious, disagreed, saying that it was premature to make such a statement, although he did accept that the 2 men had undergone a terrifying experience of some sort. The case was also investigated by UFO debunker Philip J. Klass, an editor with Aviation Week and Space Technology, and Joe Esterhaus, a writer for Rolling Stones magazine. As might be expected, their skeptical standpoint resulted in a spirited slanging match between the two sides of the UFO debate. Klaus and Esterhaus located a bridge attendant and two 24-hour toll booth operators who should have had a clear view of the abduction, but who saw nothing at the time. The abduction occurred within a few hundred yards of the busy Highway 90. Why, asked the skeptics, had no motorists witnessed the event? Hickson replied that their view would have been obscured by high bushes and the bridge railing. Sheriff Diamond came to Hickson's defense and stated that 3 unnamed motorists had indeed seen a UFO flying low in the direction of the alleged abduction. Unnamed witnesses did not impress Klaus, who turned his attention to the lie detector test that the men had passed. He discovered that the polygraph or operator had only been in practice for 1 year and that hadn't even been certified by his training school owing to his failure to complete his course. According to a licensed operator to whom Klaus spoke, such a test would need to be conducted over a full day, but Hickson's test had only lasted about 20 minutes. Joe Esterhaus did some digging of his own and discovered that Hickson had been fired from his job at the Ingalls shipyard for conduct unbecoming a supervisor. Apparently, he had been borrowing money from those working under him and had paid them back by trying to finagle them promotions. The debate between the pro and anti-UFO factions regarding the Pascagoula case continues to this day. It has become a classic, which in effect means that it is used by skeptics as a prime example of the ludicrous nature of the UFO phenomenon in general, and by some ufologists as an example of its puzzling variety and multifaceted richness. As journalist Keith Thompson says, for either side of the ongoing argument to truly win would violate one of the UFOsology's spoken rules. The debate must continue. And then that's it. Let's go ahead and let's pause it here for part 1 of Close Encounters of the Fourth Kind, there from the book UFO Sightings by Alan Baker. So let's go ahead and let's talk about that here. First off, several examples, right, when it comes to alien abductions. When a chapter mentions the Close Encounters of the Fourth Kind, it definitely means it. Here you have several of these examples, one of them actually involving an abduction of the mind, which is a first. I'm going to have to talk about that later on. But first one is the infamous all-star case of Betty and Barney Hill. Definitely the Michael Jordan of like alien abduction cases, like the number one case that's always talked about. I have people that have asked me to this day for me to talk about it and then highlight it. It's just so well known that I don't really want to get into too much info. I mean, what else can I talk about that's already been mentioned out there, right? When it comes to the case, but at least this gives an opportunity to mention something like it here. But here you have a situation where, yeah, they were just driving home. It looks like they were going to get to a place at around 2:30, 3 a.m. And then that's when they saw that quote unquote star. And then further examination revealed that there were these beings looking at them. And then, of course, you have the infamous time jump where all of a sudden it was 5 a.m. and then they started to realize that something was amiss. I noticed that the chapter didn't get into too much detail about some of the later revelations that came out from the case, but still, it was fascinating to hear some of the stuff like involving those strange shiny spots on the paintwork of the car, the compass basically spinning wildly whenever that happened, the strange dreams that were there that kept impacting Betty in particular. I like that there was that skeptical angle involving the UFO, I guess the star map that was described as well, how stars invariably, how they have billions and billions of galaxies out there, how invariably they'll start looking alike in certain circumstances, and the fact that the dreams that Betty was having could indeed be something else, some kind of suppressed memory of some sort. So interesting stuff when it came to that, but definitely good that the book highlighted it as the first one within the chapter. Plus, it brought up another good point. There seems to be different versions of aliens, right? Like there's the angelic ones that we've mentioned here on the playlist. Then there's the grays, and then there's the insect ones as well. Makes you wonder, like, and then of course there's the more humanoid ones that basically look like men that are painted a different color, that kind of stuff. Makes you wonder how these variations occur, like, and where they come from. It seems like there's just different types of species when it comes to these aliens. Then the next case was the one involving Maureen Putty, the one that happened just basically in her mind, at least as far as the question mark of that segment says. Hard to say if that's true or not, because invariably it just happened to one person, and that person just experienced it in their mind. So hard to say if that's true or not. Even some skeptics might say that it's some kind of schizophrenia or something along those lines. But if there was other witnesses that saw tangible things, that would have made more sense. So I don't know. I might chronicle that within one of my playlists later on. But otherwise, that's at least that interesting angle when it comes to UFO abduction happening in the mine. And then finally, the Pascagoula fisherman. I believe I have talked about that before too. I think I even highlighted some of those unusual, almost red flags that are standing out. Another case that has these circumstances that can potentially be disregarded. Like here you have where it's happening near a highway and nobody else really saw something. Maybe some unnamed witnesses did, but no one else really came forward to mention about the abduction. And then again, it only happened to the two people there, and no one else had any type of evidence to back it up. Interesting stuff, though. I'll have to check my playlist to see if I talked about the Pascagoula, like how far back that was. But if there's more information that I find, then I'm going to post it on here later on. Let me know what you guys think, though, as far as this new chapter, Close Encounters of the Fourth Kind. I'll do part 2 sometime in the near future. All right, everyone. Thanks again as always. Take care.